and Tobago may have forgotten that we have now an Occupational Safety and Health Act, Act 1 of 2004, as amended by Act 3 of 2006. That act came about because of the contribution in major, enormous contribution that fed into this piece of legislation that brought this act, came from the Oilfields Workers Federation. Just mind the so-called just come expert in hush. This act that we today continue to say is not even sufficient, but that to the extent that we have modern legislation to protect workers while at work and to ensure that you have a safe environment, this was contributed to overwhelmingly. Major input along the way in the drafting of this piece of legislation came from the Oilfields Workers Trade Union. Why? Because we pride ourselves of having the experience, the competence, the knowledge about working those types of environment. But even as the act was passed, there were problems. The employers and the government at the time did not want to proclaim the act because they felt that they would put power in the hands of workers to ensure their own safety while those workers were at work. And that employers felt that it will cut into their profit if they have to make work environment safe. And therefore, there were reluctance on the part of the government, even though the act was passed, to proclaim the act. And again, may I remind Trinidad and Tobago, it took an OWTU involving itself in a national campaign to get them to proclaim this act. So when we speak about occupational health and safety at the workplace, safe work environment, we come with enormous experience. And I also want to say, before I go any further, that had there been a union, or more precisely, had there been OWTU in Paria at the time, those 4 people would not have been butchered or murdered. And that's a fact. And we call it as we see it. Now, the word failure would have appeared over and over and over in this report. And failure attributed to systems of work, safe systems of work, proper job safety analysis and so on. The question of the adherence to the Occupational Health and Safety Act, work permits issue, failure across the board, and failure and bungling because of an incompetent management. Incompetent, reckless, and careless management. And today, Trinidad and Tobago, the records will show that from time immemorial to now, nobody has been held accountable for the death of workers while they perform their task to put food on the table for their family. Nobody. And we recall the subsequent, recent accident, fatality with Naikwan. Thus far, nobody has been held accountable. So people die while providing for their family. The only sin they commit, which is not a sin, the only act they commit is to go to work to try to put food on the table for their family. And employers, having not taken up their duty of care as defined in the Act, ensuring that workplaces are safe systems of work, people die. And nobody is held accountable. But you see, in this instance, the buck stops here. These people must be held accountable. Today, the families of these 4 individuals, 4 human beings who were butchered, who were murdered in a pipeline. Could you imagine what that would be? This report would have been more extensive. It would have been more detailed. More information would have been provided if those persons who were responsible for the death of these individuals, if while the investigation was taking place, that they were removed from their jobs. Remember, we had called for the removal of the management, the board, everyone who were involved to be removed while the investigation took place. That call was supported by Senior Counsel Ramesh Lawrence Moraj. But because of who is friend with whom, and close political ties, and who was friend with the man at the top, everybody kept their jobs. And as they kept their jobs, Trinidad and Tobago, they intimidated a number of witnesses. So, valuable witnesses that should have come forward, they were prevented, they were intimidated. Why? Because they want to have a job the following day. And so they were forced to not come forward. Our point here this morning is that nowhere else in the world, and perhaps we can stretch it to the universe, you can find an accident, tragedy of this nature, and those responsible, while the inquiry is taking place, they're still on their job. No, there's no model nowhere you can find where that occurs. People are asked to step aside. People are asked to go on administrative leave. People, because of their own integrity, they offer their resignation. None of the above happened, because this is Trinidad and Tobago. Trinidad and Tobago in a reckless environment by reckless leadership. And so the result is recklessness taking place, death and mayhem. And if we are not careful, and if we do not treat this with the appropriate caring hands, the diligent hands, to make sure that procedures are followed, integrity in how we go forward is performed, we can have another tragedy on our hands tomorrow somewhere else in Trinidad and Tobago. And I dare say, right in Paria itself, God forbid. But we cannot allow that as a people to go on. And so all who commented one way or the other, and all who supported, we thank you for giving your support to the families of these 4 divers thus far. And regardless of what was said today, let's go directly to where the hurt continues. The lives of the families of these 4 divers just can't move on. You could never reconcile or contemplate how they feel. Put yourself in their shoe. And let's examine a couple things in this report that we were saying that the report captured that vindicate us. And as I said, the word failure appeared over and over again in the report. But let me also say that the corporate manslaughter, let's go to the corporate manslaughter, because that seems to be the subject of a lot of attention, whether it should happen, or who should be charged, or who should not be charged. So, the point was made is that Paria is guilty of corporate manslaughter. And on page 295, recommendation 40, and I quote, we recommend to the Director of Public Prosecution that on the evidence before this commission, we find that there are sufficient grounds to conclude that Paria's negligence could be characterized as gross negligence and consequently criminal. We do not conclude that the same is true for LMCS, as we are of the view that they were effectively prevented from pursuing a rescue by Paria. Now, picture yourself in that situation. Not in the situation of a haughty management, who was politically appointed in the first place. But picture yourself in the pipeline. And picture now that Paria, the entity that awarded the contract, prevented the contractor from effectively pursuing a rescue. Paria. But Paria is not the building. Paria is not just the name Paria or the logo. No. Paria is people. It's people who are at the top in the management of Paria. So when they talk about corporate manslaughter, criminal negligence, and so on, the corporate is not the building or the logo. It's people. It's people who perform in the corporate. And therefore there's where we want to go this morning, to deal with the people who through their gross incompetence and gross negligence contributed to what can be described as a criminal act. Which criminal act led to the death of 4 human beings. And may I remind Trinidad and Tobago that one of the divers, Budram, when he came out, he informed them that, listen, my 4 comrades, they are still alive, and that no effort should be spared to rescue them, and that for hours and days we continue to hear the knocking in the pipeline, indicating that there's life, people are alive. Just remember that. Remember that. And that to the extent that Paria even instructed the Coast Guard to prevent any rescue, they are culpable. But the building did not instruct that. It's not the building or the logo did not do that. It's people who did that. And this morning we want to name those people. You see, again, their biggest achievement, Trinidad and Tobago, one deceased Franklin Can, the most lying person we have ever encountered on any planet possible. Tell a lot of lies about the petroleum workers, Franklin Can. And thank God he has gone. Yeah, you often say that, but thank God he has gone. We don't know where he gone, but thank God he has gone. Lied on the workers. But Franklin Can's and Keith Rowley's biggest achievement, and Stuart Young's biggest achievement, is what? Is to get the union out of Petrotrin. But getting a union out of a work environment contributes to gross negligence for performance and consequently because nobody else looks out for the interests and the lives of workers but their union. And so the blood of those 4 divers is on the hands of Keith Rowley, Stuart Young, Franklin Can, Franklin Can, and all who supported removing OWTU from Petrotrin, reorganizing Petrotrin, and having one of the most unsafe operations in Trinidad and Tobago today. Not just that, but even in the fields and offshore, it is occurring because there's no type of regulation and so on. So let's delve in a little more as we talk someone by the name of Narissa Fevic, the report is saying, let's quote the report. Narissa Fevic was said to work closely with Mustaq Mohammed in coordinating and organizing Paria's communication to the divers' families. Here too, there was an abject failure to achieve that relatively simple task, leaving the families camped out in the car park for hours and days on end without facilities or information in the near first 24 hours of this tragedy is frankly unforgivable. See what the report says. Unforgivable. And then again, on page 281, 2 families were left to camp in the car park at the gates of Paria's facilities for days until some measure of assistance was given to them, largely by public outcry and the intervention of the union. And the intervention of the union. And while I identify everybody else by name, I want to remind the public, it wasn't just the intervention of the union, it was the intervention of the Always workers from day one. That, on any view, must be unacceptable. That's what the report says. So here you have a situation where all of your procedures, all of your systems of work, all of your permitting system, everything, it's a comedy of errors from the beginning that was set up. If no order was brought, it was set up to fail and cause death from the beginning, from the get-go. And that is what occurred. And therefore we are saying that it cannot be that at the end of all of this, business continue as usual. Business cannot continue as usual. Indeed, Trinidad and Tobago, business cannot continue as usual in Trinidad and Tobago after a damning report in the nature of this one. Cannot, must not. And so, we join the overwhelming clarion call. It's the OWTU. We enjoin ourselves to the overwhelming clarion call by right-thinking citizens for the removal of that Paria board immediately. The board must bear full responsibility, and specifically, whether or not he is connected to anybody at the top, middle, or bottom, wherever he is connected, this report, our position, must not take that into consideration. What we must take into consideration is that he failed, and he was part of unfortunate debacle that led to taking the lives of these 4 human beings. And so this morning, we want to call specifically for the removal of Newman George. Newman George must go. I'm going to say that again, because we want to send this message to where it's supposed to be heard. And for if they are smart enough, if they have any little shred of common sense remaining, integrity remaining, they would remove Newman George immediately. Other people must also bear responsibility. General Manager Mustaq Mohammed, coming from a quarry environment and offshore environment, Mustaq Mohammed, General Manager, must go. No, yes. And of course, their communication lead who would have failed in the former Petrotrin, but who had the right connections to get that job, communication lead must go also. And we come to another name that we know from inception is a failure. In fact, Petrotrin would have failed to promote him because of his continuous failure. The union would have never supported him to be in charge of anything. But he was the incident commander and part of the tapestry of failure that caused the death of these 4 human beings. We call for the removal of Colin Piper. And there's a lot of talk about whether or not criminal action can be taken, whether or not the time has expired for that. All kinds of discussion. But we are saying this morning that the state has a responsibility, in addition to what the DPP is looking at. The state has a responsibility to take civil actions against those responsible as a matter of urgency and in the national interest. This morning, respectfully, we urge the DPP to spare no effort to ensure that every angle is covered to bring justice to the families. And of course, as right-thinking human beings, decent human beings, we join all the law-abiding and decent people in this country who are now calling for adequate compensation for all of the families. There should be no barrier. Absolutely no. In fact, that should not be a second thought. In fact, the fact that to date, that these families continue to go without bread, nobody cared thus far. To date, it's a tragedy. And it shows how callous, how reckless and careless, how don't care damn those persons in charge and who regularly say to the country that we care. Well, the people, right-thinking people of this country care about those families and we demand compensation. Yes. And of course, as I close, let me also remind Trinidad and Tobago, the public, about this death, this fatality, this accident that took place in Naikwan not too long ago, that they continue to hold very closely to their chest the investigation report. That's public assets that was carved up and given to in all kinds of questionable arrangements. No union is in that environment. Worker died, but you hear nothing. This morning, we want to also call for the producing of that report of the inquiry into the Naikwan death. Thank you very much. Right. Any questions?
And you talked about how it's people involved when they spoke about corporate manslaughter. So you're suggesting individual criminal charges?
Yes.
City management or
yes.
the incident command team?
Yes. Yes.
Everyone?
Yes. All who were involved in and identified in the report, who were involved in the rescue effort, and as a result of their failure, we are now discussing this today. All of them. We call for handcuffs to be placed on all of them and then they make jail in this country in this regard. Employers will begin to sit up and take notice and do the right thing according to law. And let me also say, the government, then and now, has abdicated its responsibility to, in accordance with this act, to put the required personnel in place. Today, the Occupational Health and Safety Act is starved to be properly operationalized because there is a lack of personnel, OSH inspectors and so on. Yes? And those that are there, they are on contract. So they are afraid, they are intimidated to really pronounce on their craft, to ensure that workplaces are safe, to ensure that governments workplaces which are among the most unsafe workplaces, that those workplaces are made a safe work environment.
Oh.
So the Ministry of Labor and the Minister of Labor, after this and continue to run a butcher shop when we should have a proper and operationalized Occupational Safety and Health Act staffed with permanent inspectors in permanent jobs, doing their jobs diligently without fear of intimidation. That is what we have. Contract all over the place, even in this very important entity. And you would find that unfortunately, God forbid, you might find that we might have tragedies, and nobody will get to the root of the problem because they are afraid and scared. And so those persons who are responsible for putting safety systems in place and so on prior to, they too, action ought to be taken against those persons. They created an unsafe work environment. And of course, as that unsafe work environment was created, marked for death were those persons who were asked to perform duty on that day, because the rescue effort at all, which is the last bastion to save lives, they failed in that regard. They must make a jail because of that.
You're looking at what manslaughter charges?
Well, we urge the DPP to use the competence we know that he has, the skill we know that he has, the experience we know that he has in his office, and we ask those who are responsible for giving him the resources to ensure that he has at his disposal all of the resources to properly well scrutinize, to ensure that every angle is covered, to make sure that persons are brought to justice. Yeah? And as I said, it's not the building and it's not the logo. Corporate is about the people, and it's the people who prevented people from rescuing people. That is
And now with regards to the board of directors, what do you think was their failure, and what do you think they should have done during that that time when the men were in the pipeline?
Well, it's captured in the report. It's captured in the report, and also remember, they were part of the overall fabric of prevention, of preventing the rescue effort. Yeah.
Question. This question is from Sean Mohammed, all the way from Canada. He says, what is LNC's role, stroke accountability in all of this?
Well, our focus is Paria, because at the end of the day, we have no end of judgment, Mr. Canada, that says that at the end of the day, the ultimate employer is the one who awarded the contract. Too often, employers use that model to hive off their responsibility to a contractor, and they did not oversee properly what the contractor is doing. Yeah?
Now, based on the recommendations of the report, and obviously their overall recommendations for the type of work being done in the system and for health and safety in general, do you think that moving forward, apart from Paria and all the other major energy companies, do you think that these recommendations will be taken on?
Well, that's why, exactly, that's a very fair and good question, because we have had large vaults with piles of recommendations that just stays in the vault of all of those companies. And we know that because we would be part of investigation and so on that bring to bear at the end of it recommendations. But I tell you, even where the union is present, we have to press them on a daily basis to implement those recommendations. What do you think will happen in areas where you don't have a union present? Yeah? So it is all about not just the investigation for investigating's sake, for public relations and so on, but it's about getting to the root cause, dealing with it, and making sure that all of the recommendations that emanate from these investigations, that they are implemented to the letter. Yeah? And the policemen, those who are responsible to investigate and to monitor and to make sure that those recommendations are in place so that no further lives will be lost. Is this the Occupational Health and Safety Act and its inspectors and so on. And so we also call for proper staffing and job security for those persons who perform this task on a daily basis. And remember, let me just say this, taxpayers benefit because this is a public company. Taxpayers benefit when workers go out and work, whether it's offshore, extract the oil and gas and so on, and BP Shell, people make profits and so on. But if you didn't have people, working people to do it, people putting their lives at risk, all those investments would come to zero. All we ask for is for when people, workers, human beings go to perform tasks that Trinidad and Tobago will benefit, that you treat them with the proper duty of care, and you treat them with the proper status and make sure that they return home safely to their families at the end of the day. So, thank you very much for coming and covering. You will be hearing a lot more from us on this as the minutes and hours and days go by, because we will be looking closely to see what happens next if they are going to ignore the barrage, the major call, the colossal call by the majority of citizens to get rid of these people and allow for a fresh breath of safe air to flow into that environment. That environment is tainted. And as I said, the blood of these four divers, these four human beings, rest on the hands of those who organize the company, take the union out, and have all kinds of chaotic and irresponsible behavior on the part of an incompetent and reckless management taking place. We call for that to cease today. Today is the day we must bring an end to it. Yeah? So good.
You can roll up the constitution one more time again.
Which one? Wait, which one you want?
The book you
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, just looking at all the pages, a very voluminous report. Yeah, great to hold this. I think we first use. Alright, so that the entire board and management must go. We want the whole blinking market to go. Yeah? Alright. The rest of them jail the back, so.
Lock them up.
Lock them up. Lock them up. Lock them up.
No.
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 Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. All right. Them up.
No.
Lock 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 them up.
I always know. We were there lock up. Time to that.
Lock.
Lock them up. Lock